Mr. Harold. Next speaker, Mr. Harold Agnall.
I would like to invite Mr. Graham William from ACNAL. He's a good friend of mine, and also he's the Nation Without States committee member as well, who intend to bring a lot of other nations like us, not only Tamils suffers the way it's genocide, but there are a lot of other people, Kurdistan people here. There is Malaysian lady, Solak. Pardon me, she hates to be represented as Malaysian, but the Malaysia does not even count the Kurds on the side of it, right? So that's the way to be. She is very proud of her place. And we should be, if somebody asks me, where are you from? I should say Tamil, not Sri Lanka. That's the way it should be, right? I would like to invite Graham to give a small speech. Thank you.
I don't mind doing it here. I didn't prepare a speech today. I just came to show solidarity on this subject. I agree with what the last gentleman said. So at the end of the day, unless Tamils are prepared to do something, nobody else will. You can't expect non-Tamils to fight your cause if you won't fight it yourself. And you have to make sacrifices, otherwise nothing will ever change. On this point about boycotting, ACNAL originally did boycotting after the end of the conflict in 2009. Some of you will know, one or two of you were involved. We produced a strategy paper, which I believe is as relevant now as it was then. And the strategy basically was this: we believe in the principle of self-determination, the right of all peoples to be independent or to choose their future. It could be autonomy, it could be integration. It's the people's choice. And the only way that's going to happen in Sri Lanka, and in fact in most cases, is probably now going to be a UN supervised referendum, where there'll be a legitimacy of a state, and the world will have to recognise it. It's been done before in Kosovo, East Timor, South Sudan recently, and a few other places. But how are we going to obtain that referendum, since it's so difficult to get, since Sri Lanka doesn't want, obviously, to allow Tamils to have that right, and the same in many parts of the world. Those governments don't want to allow it. We basically said there was only two ways of achieving that. One was political action and lobbying, and the other was economic. Now the political action, sadly, has failed. The world knows that things occurred in Sri Lanka at the end of the war. People in the world know that there's things going on now against Tamils in Sri Lanka. But the world isn't interested. And the reason why the world isn't interested is because they've got other agendas, geopolitical agendas, which are much more important to those countries than human rights. So don't ever be confused when you hear about David Cameron saying we're going to bomb somebody tomorrow because of human rights. It's never about human rights, but they use that as the excuse. So we can't expect too much at the moment from the international community in terms of Sri Lanka. And India, we can expect even less, because India is in competition with Sri Lanka, with China, over Sri Lanka and trade with Sri Lanka. So we can't really expect too much politically. So what else is there left? Well, there is economic. And the economic strategy is this. If Sri Lanka suffers economically in its income through its exports, through the foreign monies that it receives through people travelling to Sri Lanka, if it has a reduction in that income, then the business world of Sri Lanka will put pressure on the government to produce a political settlement. There is no other way. South Africa wasn't brought to its knees by the famous boycotts we talk about. What happened was the businessmen of South Africa put pressure on to do a deal with the majority population in South Africa. So that the business world put pressure on the politicians. It wasn't the politicians putting pressure on themselves. They didn't really want to change their ways. They changed because they were pressured by their own people. So our strategy was, if we could put pressure on Sri Lankan businessmen by making it difficult for them to trade around the world, they will put pressure on their own government to allow, for instance, a referendum. And that economic war would be fought in two ways. One would be sanctions. And in fact, the sanctions are the most important aspect of any economic war. The reason is that if you stop the import of products into a country, you are cutting off a whole revenue stream. If you cut off a few people buying garments, you're cutting off just a few pounds. So sanctions are clearly the most effective way. And in fact, the GSP Plus reduction was in fact a very significant victory for the cause. In fact, it's been probably the only real victory, in my opinion, in the whole struggle since 2009, has been the GSP Plus. And that, of course, isn't particularly significant, but it did hurt Sri Lanka economically. But what is the other part of that economic struggle? Well, that is boycotting itself. Okay? I admit that the boycotting of Sri Lankan products in terms of the high street is quite ineffective, because Act Now began a boycotting campaign outside Gap, well, Marks and Spencer's initially, and then it moved to Gap, mainly because it was thought that Gap might be more moral and may in fact not want to be seen to be trading in Sri Lanka. But sadly it turns out that they don't care. Most of these companies don't particularly care about their PR. And it has to become a tipping point when there's so many people doing it that in the end they have to give up trading with Sri Lanka. At the moment, they look around the world and they see that the world isn't really acting against Sri Lanka, so why should they? And also, of course, if you're asking a person not to buy a garment from Gap that's got a Sri Lankan label on, how much money is that going to affect them? We found that only a very small minority of people are prepared to boycott. So in effect, all we were doing was profiling the cause. In other words, we're making people aware there's a problem in Sri Lanka, please take notice. The lesson we've learned is that the only way to be effective is to target, and target areas which is going to be most effective. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is target people who are spending lots of money in Sri Lanka, for instance tourists. If you go to Sri Lanka, you're going to spend a lot of money flying there, and you're going to spend a lot of money, presumably, spending on the island. If you stop somebody, if you can, buying a garment from Gap, you're going to cost them 20 pence, if that. And most people are not prepared not to go into that shop because you're outside with a placard. This was even the case with the South African boycott. The South African boycott was successful because they got sanctions against South Africa from governments. Sanctions from governments are effective because they're talking about millions of pounds. Stopping Gap selling a few t-shirts is obviously small beer. So the boycott needs to target the most effective area, and I think tourism is one of them. The other type of boycotting, of course, it is political, and that's cricket and other diplomatic connections. Because there, of course, cricket's very important to Sri Lanka, as it was to South Africa. And the South Africans being banned from going around the world, that was pressure put on the government to try and alleviate that. So it all builds up pressure, but you have to target. You have to target. But the main problem we found, when we ran probably the longest running boycott campaign of all, was Act Now's. But the problem we found is that nobody wanted to do it. Very few Tamils were prepared to boycott. You know, we were out on the high street every weekend or every other weekend. We were doing email campaigns to Gap. We were doing lots of things. But most of you weren't there. Because most Tamils weren't prepared to boycott. Why? I've never had a satisfactory answer to that, because I think most Tamils were embarrassed to actually give a reason why they weren't boycotting or weren't involved in it. So my guess is, and people have told me when they've been less embarrassed, is because they didn't feel it was effective and they themselves couldn't be bothered to make that next step. For instance, we said, well, why are you buying products that have been imported from Sri Lanka in Tamil shops? Why don't the Tamil shops buy that chili powder from India as apart from Sri Lanka? It was just habit. Yeah? So the bottom line is you cannot run a boycott campaign unless you as a people's adopt it. You cannot expect non-Tamils to boycott Sri Lanka if you won't do it yourself. So the first target, as my friend said in the corner, is yourselves. Yeah? Unless you're prepared to boycott Sri Lankan products or go to Sri Lanka, unless it's I've got a very good reason for doing it. You know, it's not a holiday basically. If you do it for charity or you do it for business, maybe you can help the Tamil people over there. But most people, I think, who go to Sri Lanka go on holiday. So obviously that's not to help the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. And if anything, it's helping